Cheating doesn't begin the moment someone crosses a physical line. It starts long before that. It begins in the subtle shifts, the quiet exits, the emotional gaps that widen over time. And the most heartbreaking part? Often your gut feels it before your brain can explain it. You sense something's off, but you can't quite name it. That's because cheaters don't always act like villains. Sometimes they act like victims. Sometimes they act like nothing's wrong at all. But if you pay attention, there's always a pattern. The goal here isn't to turn you into someone who's paranoid. It's to empower you to trust your instincts, to recognize the signs before betrayal turns into heartbreak. Because protecting your peace isn't about controlling someone else's choices. It's about refusing to ignore the quiet ways they start choosing against you. They don't always slam the door on your heart. They slip out quietly, long before you realize they're gone. Emotional distance is often the first step cheaters take, and it's the one that hurts the most because it's invisible. It doesn't show up in a single moment. It shows up in the accumulation of small changes. They stop asking about your day. They don't really listen when you talk. Their responses get shorter. Where there was once warmth, curiosity, and connection, there's now silence or surface-level talk that avoids any emotional depth. They may still sit next to you, sleep beside you, or go out with you, but something is missing, and you feel it in your bones. At first, you might rationalize it. Maybe they're just tired. Maybe work's been stressful. Maybe they're going through something they don't know how to talk about. And sometimes that's true. But when someone starts consistently withdrawing and doesn't make the effort to reconnect, it's often because they're already detaching in their mind. They're rehearsing the breakup emotionally before they act on it physically. They might not even be fully conscious of it, but they know that they're starting to want something else, something different, or someone else. And instead of talking to you about it, they quietly begin creating space. This kind of distance is confusing. You try to bridge the gap, to reach out, to initiate conversations. You ask, "Is everything okay?" and get vague answers. "I'm fine, just tired, nothing's wrong." But you can feel it. The enthusiasm is gone. They don't light up when they see you anymore. They're less affectionate. You catch them looking at their phone more than they look at you. And slowly, you begin to question yourself. Did I do something? Am I not enough? You start adjusting yourself to pull them back in, being extra sweet, more patient, pretending not to notice how disconnected they've become just to keep the peace. But that's the trap. You start losing yourself trying to hold on to someone who's already emotionally walked away. The truth is, when someone is emotionally invested, even if they're going through something difficult, they'll still want to stay connected. They'll still care about how you feel. They'll make an effort, even if it's small, to reassure you that you're still a team. But when emotional distance sets in with no attempt to repair it, it's a sign that they're mentally moving out of the relationship. And often, that space they create is where someone else eventually walks in. Because when people start detaching emotionally, it's usually because they're making room for something or someone new. This isn't about reading too much into every quiet moment. Relationships go through waves. People have bad days, even bad months. But there's a difference between temporary withdrawal and a slow, steady disappearance of emotional presence. You know the difference. It feels different in your body. One feels like someone who's still with you, just struggling. The other feels like someone who's already made a decision they haven't told you about. The hardest part about emotional distance is how it gaslights your intuition. Because everything might look fine on the surface. No big fights, no clear betrayal. But something feels off and you can't prove it. So you stay. You hope. You try harder. But the more you do, the more invisible you feel. And what's really happening is that they're creating the emotional exit ramp to make what comes next feel easier for them, less messy, less guilt-inducing. By the time the cheating happens, if it happens, it feels less like a choice and more like something that just happened because they've already convinced themselves the relationship was over in some way. You deserve more than someone who fades without a word. You deserve someone who stays emotionally available even when things get hard. Someone who talks to you when something's off instead of shutting you out. Because love doesn't disappear without notice. It's withdrawn, withheld, and rationed by people who want out but don't want to be honest about it. Emotional distance is not just space, it's a warning, one you should never ignore, even when you wish you could. When someone's about to cheat, they often start rewriting the story of your relationship. Not out loud, but in their own mind. They begin to downplay the good moments and magnify the bad ones. Suddenly, every disagreement you've had becomes a sign that things were never really right. They start seeing you not as the person they once loved, but as the obstacle to their happiness. This mental rewriting isn't accidental. It's a psychological buffer that allows them to justify behavior they know would otherwise go against their own values. In order to cheat, they need to believe they're not the villain. So they construct a narrative where they're the victim, trapped, misunderstood, unappreciated. And in that storyline, infidelity becomes the act of escape or self-fulfillment, not betrayal. What makes this shift so difficult to spot is that it often doesn't come with obvious conflict. They might not start fights or argue more. Instead, they subtly detach. They stop appreciating the things you do. They forget the moments you've held space for them, supported them, believed in them. Instead, their focus shifts to everything you're not doing. You're too busy. You're not affectionate enough. You don't understand them anymore. These ideas start quietly echoing in their mind and over time become the lens through which they see everything. This story helps them feel less guilt when boundaries begin to blur elsewhere. After all, how can it be cheating if they believe the relationship was already broken? This mental rewriting also serves another purpose. It allows them to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Rather than expressing dissatisfaction or working on problems together, they internalize their discontent and allow it to fester. It becomes ammunition for an unspoken war. The longer this narrative goes unchecked, the more distorted it becomes. They may even start telling friends half-truths or venting selectively to gain external validation. We've been unhappy for a long time. She's just not the same anymore. I feel more like a roommate than a partner. These kinds of statements aren't always rooted in fact, but in the revised version of reality that justifies stepping outside the relationship. If you sense this happening, it can be deeply disorienting. You may feel like you're trying to hold on to something real while the other person is slowly dismantling it from the inside out. You'll notice their tone change. You'll feel them growing colder, more dismissive, quicker to criticize and slower to praise. They may still show up, still say, "I love you," still do the things that look like commitment, but the heart behind it is missing because in their mind they've already begun to separate. And once that narrative is fully formed, cheating doesn't feel like a moral failure, it feels like a natural next step. This behavior is particularly dangerous because it blindsides the person. On the receiving end, you might think things are okay, or at least salvageable, only to realize the other person has already written you out of the future they see for themselves. And because they never voiced the true extent of their discontent, you didn't get the chance to show up differently, to repair things together. That's one of the most painful parts of betrayal. Not just the act itself, but the slow erosion that happened in silence, while you were still giving your best. It's important to note that if someone wants out, they owe you a conversation, not a justification after the fact. They owe you honesty, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Anyone can find flaws in a relationship if they look for them long enough. But real character is shown in how someone deals with those flaws, whether they run from them or work through them. Mental rewriting is an avoidance tactic. It's a way of exiting without having to feel the full weight of what they're doing. And when someone chooses to cheat, armed with that rewritten story, it doesn't make their actions any less damaging. It just means they weren't willing to do the hard, honest thing, speak the truth and take accountability. If you've ever been on the receiving end of this behavior, it can leave you questioning your entire history together. You wonder how long they've been rewriting the script, when the shift began and what you could have done differently. But the truth is, someone who chooses to rewrite the truth rather than confront it was never committed to the growth required to maintain a real relationship. You can't control the story they tell themselves, but you can choose not to internalize it. You know the truth of who you were in that relationship. Hold on to that, because the way they exit says far more about them than it does about you. When someone is heading down the path of cheating, their behavior often begins to show up in subtle but undeniable shifts in how they communicate. One of the most common signs is that they suddenly become emotionally unavailable. And not in the obvious "I'm done with this" kind of way. It's quieter. They're still physically present, answering your texts, sitting across a dinner table. But it starts to feel like they're not really with you. Their responses get shorter, more surface level. Conversations that used to have depth become shallow. You ask how their day was, and they give you the basics. You try to talk about something important, and they brush it off or get irritable. You begin to feel like you're reaching for someone who's no longer extending a hand back. Emotional unavailability in this context isn't always intentional. Sometimes the person doesn't even fully realize it themselves. But the reason it happens is because part of their attention, maybe even their affection, has started to drift elsewhere. When someone's starting to form a connection outside of the relationship, even if they haven't acted on it yet, they often start withholding intimacy at home. That might mean they stop sharing their feelings, they avoid eye contact during vulnerable moments, or they keep things vague when you ask how they're doing. It's like watching someone slowly build a wall between you, brick by brick, using silence as mortar. At first, you might try to rationalize it. Maybe they're stressed, maybe they're tired, maybe it's just a phase. And while that's a natural response, because you want to give the benefit of the doubt, it's also what makes this behavior so easy to ignore. You find yourself overcompensating. You initiate more, try harder, ask more questions, plan more quality time, hoping they'll open back up. But the truth is, emotional distance that comes from someone entertaining another option doesn't get solved by you doing more. It's not about your lack of effort, it's about where their focus is drifting. Another shift you might notice is that their tone becomes more guarded. If you ask questions about their schedule, their friends, or how they spent their day, they get defensive or evasive. It's not necessarily what they say, it's how they say it. Suddenly, normal check-ins feel like interrogations to them. You feel like you have to tiptoe around topics that used to be completely open. This emotional defensiveness isn't always about guilt. It's about creating space. It's a way for them to protect whatever they're entertaining on the side by keeping you at a distance. And even if nothing physical has happened yet, the emotional energy is already being rerouted. That's what creates the disconnection. The irony is, in a healthy relationship, communication should deepen over time. You should grow more comfortable, more open, more honest. But when someone's gearing up to cheat or is even just flirting with the idea, communication tends to go in the opposite direction. Instead of deepening, it flattens. Instead of expanding, it contracts. You sense them pulling away, but they won't admit to anything. So you start questioning your own instincts. That internal conflict creates anxiety, and you may begin to blame yourself. Maybe I've been too emotional. Maybe I've asked for too much. But the truth is, you're not the problem. The distance is a choice they're making, not a result of something you've done wrong. One of the most disorienting parts of this phase is that it can exist for a long time before anything happens. The cheating might not occur for weeks or months, but by the time it does, they've already created so much space between you that they've emotionally justified it. That's why paying attention to how someone communicates is so important. You don't need to be paranoid, but you do need to be honest with yourself when the connection feels different. When you feel more alone with someone than you did when you were single. That feeling is data. Don't dismiss it. You deserve someone who's all the way in, someone who wants to talk to you, who looks forward to hearing about your day, who shares theirs openly, someone who doesn't make you feel like you're prying just for wanting to feel close. Communication is the heartbeat of any relationship, and when it begins to slow down or become erratic, it's often a signal that something deeper is shifting. Trust yourself to recognize when that's happening, not to accuse or attack, but to protect your peace and stay connected to your truth. Because no matter what anyone else chooses to do, you deserve clarity, honesty, and emotional presence. And if those aren't on the table, it might be time to ask yourself why you're still sitting there. Another red flag that often flies quietly under the radar before someone cheats is a subtle change in how they respond to your wins, your joy, and your self-expression. What once felt like support starts to turn into indifference or even quiet resentment. They might not say it outright, but you can feel it. When you share something you're excited about, a project you're passionate about, a new goal, a compliment someone gave you, they don't light up with you. They might nod, give a dry, "That's great," or even find a way to downplay it. It's not the response itself that hurts, it's the emotional vacuum behind it. And it starts to make you feel like maybe your joy is too much. Maybe your ambition is too big. Maybe your light is shining in the wrong direction. And what's happening here isn't always conscious. But when someone is drifting emotionally, and particularly when they've started fantasizing about someone else, they often stop investing in your emotional world. They disengage from celebrating you because they've disconnected from building a future with you. And instead of bringing themselves closer, they begin to create space by minimizing your emotional highs. It's not that they suddenly hate your success or your spark. It's that they can't find a place for themselves in it anymore. So it becomes easier to detach than to lean in. That detachment is often masked as being tired, distracted, or just not in the mood. But you notice it because the emotional intimacy that once existed is now missing in moments where you need it most. Even more insidious is when your self-expression starts to irritate them. Maybe you've always been playful, affectionate, enthusiastic, but suddenly they're rolling their eyes, sighing, or telling you to tone it down. You find yourself shrinking, not out of insecurity, but in reaction to the coldness that's begun to meet your warmth. That's a dangerous shift because it conditions you to question your natural self. You start walking on eggshells, wondering what version of you is acceptable that day. And when you begin to feel emotionally unsafe being your full self, the relationship has already begun to erode. Why does this happen? Because cheating often starts with disconnection, not just from you, but from who they were in the relationship. And when someone is no longer emotionally invested, your expressions of connection, joy, or hope become uncomfortable reminders of the emotional gap they're unwilling or unable to close. They'd rather pull back than face the truth that they're slowly exiting emotionally while still occupying space in your life. This is why many people who cheat say things like, "I just didn't feel connected anymore," or "I felt like I couldn't be myself." But often what they really mean is, "I stopped being willing to meet the emotional demands of a real relationship." There's also a psychological element of projection at play. When someone starts to betray the relationship in small, unseen ways, whether it's flirting inappropriately, fantasizing about someone else, or mentally checking out, they often begin to resent you for the very qualities they used to love. Why? Because those qualities remind them of who they're failing to show up for. It's easier to pick at you than to look in the mirror. So they'll start seeing your strength as stubbornness, your sensitivity as neediness, your independence as distance. That reversal creates confusion and self-doubt in you. You begin to wonder if you're too much, if you're doing something wrong, if you're the one creating the tension. But it's not you, it's their unresolved guilt showing up as emotional sabotage. In healthy relationships, partners lift each other, they protect joy, they celebrate the wins even when they're busy. They know that when one person shines, it adds light to both lives. But when someone's on the verge of cheating, their internal conflict makes them pull back from that celebration. They stop showing up emotionally, not always because they've made a decision to cheat, but because emotionally they've already started to leave. That's why it's so important to pay attention to how your emotional world is being received. If you feel like your excitement is being met with disinterest, if your vulnerability is being dismissed, if your growth is being minimized, it's not a sign to dim yourself. It's a signal to ask deeper questions about the emotional health of the relationship. You should never feel like you have to shrink to keep someone close. Your joy, your wins, your expressive self, those are the very things that should be safe, protected, and celebrated in love. When those things become inconvenient or unwelcome, you're no longer being emotionally partnered, you're being tolerated. And that's not love. That's someone slowly walking out with their feet still in the room. Recognizing this shift early is how you protect your peace and your power, not by reacting with fear, but by grounding yourself in the truth that you deserve someone who claps the loudest when you shine. One of the lesser discussed but incredibly telling behaviors of someone who may cheat is the subtle rewriting of the relationship narrative while they're still in it. They start planting little seeds of dissatisfaction. At first they're small, throwaway comments like, "We don't really connect like we used to," or "I feel like something's missing between us." On the surface, it sounds honest, even mature, but over time, it becomes clear. This isn't about working through problems. It's about emotionally checking out while crafting a justification for it. They aren't seeking to fix anything. They're slowly rewriting the story so that when they do betray your trust, they can look back and say, "We weren't really happy anyway." This mindset shift often precedes cheating. It's not always about physical desire or a better connection elsewhere. It's about emotional disengagement. When someone wants to cheat or is getting close to it, they begin to reshape their internal narrative so that they feel like less of the bad guy. That guilt has to go somewhere, and it usually doesn't go inward. It goes toward blaming the relationship, blaming the dynamic, and eventually blaming you. Suddenly, problems that were once minor become the defining traits of your relationship in their eyes. Arguments you've had are now the reason they couldn't open up. Your needs are reframed as pressure. Your healthy boundaries are described as controlling. And the things you've both done wrong, only your part seems to get remembered. This kind of emotional distancing often manifests in how they talk about you to others. Pay attention to how they describe your relationship when you're not around, because that's where the story gets rewritten the fastest. If they're venting to friends, painting themselves as trapped or unappreciated without ever talking about what they've done to contribute to that feeling, that's a red flag. That's the ground being prepared for a betrayal. Because now, if they cheat, it won't feel like a betrayal to them. It'll feel like an escape. They've edited the story in their head so that they're no longer the person who stepped out. They're the one who was pushed out. You may also notice a subtle switch in how they respond to intimacy. They don't seem interested in emotional closeness anymore. And when you bring it up, they deflect or make you feel like you're being overly sensitive. It's not just a lack of affection. It's a lack of willingness to repair emotional disconnect. They're no longer invested in solving the issues. They're invested in proving silently that the issues exist. And that shift is devastating because it leaves you doing all the work. You're trying to have the hard conversations, trying to reconnect, trying to rekindle something that they've already decided is broken. Not because it's truly unfixable, but because they need it to be broken in order to justify stepping outside of it. This slow withdrawal is hard to spot, especially if you're the kind of person who wants to give the benefit of the doubt. But it becomes clearer when you realize that a partner who truly wants to repair things shows up even in conflict. They listen, they work through it, they care about how you feel. But someone who's mentally preparing to cheat, they don't want resolution, they want rationale. And they'll collect emotional grievances, whether real or exaggerated, so they can tell themselves a story where cheating wasn't betrayal, it was inevitable. This rewriting isn't always verbal either. It can happen through silence, when someone stops talking to you, stops sharing their day, stops engaging with your life. They're not just distant, they're detaching. And the most painful part is that you can feel it, even if they never say it. You know something shifted. You can sense the wall going up. And when you try to talk about it, they act like you're imagining things, like you're the problem for being so reactive. That gaslighting only deepens your anxiety, making you question your instincts, when in truth, your gut is just picking up on what they won't admit. They've already started separating their heart from yours. The danger of this narrative shift is that it doesn't just lead to betrayal, it leaves you carrying the shame. When the cheating happens, you'll look back and remember all those comments, all those moments of emotional neglect, and you'll wonder if you caused it, if only you'd done more, if only you'd changed faster. But that's the lie their behavior was designed to implant. You were never the reason they cheated. Their inability to face and resolve emotional discomfort, their fear of true intimacy, their selfishness, that's what led them away. Recognizing this pattern early gives you the power to protect your peace. It allows you to call out the emotional distance and demand either honesty or effort. If you sense that someone is rewriting the story instead of writing the next chapter with you, don't ignore that. That's not someone fighting for the relationship. That's someone quietly exiting it. And you deserve someone who builds the story with you, not someone who edits you out of it. When someone is gearing up to cheat, one of the final and most dangerous shifts in their behavior is a sudden surge of charm. And this isn't just the normal ebb and flow of affection in a relationship. It's not spontaneous romance or a deepened connection. It's strategic. It's preemptive damage control. This charm is often over the top, out of character, or just oddly timed. It shows up after a string of cold behavior or emotional distance. You start noticing gestures that feel like they should mean something, but they're not backed up by real vulnerability. They buy you gifts, become unusually attentive, or suddenly plan a weekend getaway, and yet emotionally, they still feel far away. It's confusing, because part of you wants to believe that things are getting better, but another part of you knows something isn't right. What's happening here is a psychological phenomenon that often precedes betrayal, the guilty conscience trying to overcompensate. Before someone cheats, especially if they have even a sliver of self-awareness, they often try to reassure both you and themselves that they're a good person. They try to create a buffer of kindness to either buy time, ease their guilt, or keep you from asking too many questions. The charm isn't about reconnection, it's about cover. And it's incredibly disorienting because it creates a false sense of security. You stop questioning the emotional red flags because the surface looks so good, but what you're feeling underneath still doesn't match the gestures being offered. This charm can also come from fear, not fear of losing you, but fear of being caught. When someone knows they're walking a dangerous line, they start managing optics. They want to make sure that if anything comes to light, they can point to all the good they've done recently. They want plausible deniability. So they do things like post couple photos, compliment you in front of friends, or suddenly take interest in something they've ignored for months. It feels like progress, but it's actually manipulation. It's not about reconnecting with you, it's about protecting themselves. And the irony is, this charm phase often delays the moment of clarity for the person being betrayed. Because how do you reconcile someone who's buying you flowers with someone who's emotionally checked out? How do you question someone's loyalty when they're doing everything society tells us a good partner should do? That's the trap. You stop trusting your gut. You start rewriting the story in your own head to match their actions, even though your heart knows the energy behind them is off. And the longer this charm continues, the more you begin to doubt your own instincts, your memory of how things used to feel, your right to even bring up concerns. That self-doubt is exactly what the cheater needs to keep moving without accountability. It's important to distinguish between real connection and compensatory behavior. Real intimacy is built on honesty, consistency, and shared vulnerability. It's not just romantic gestures, it's tough conversations, shared growth, and mutual emotional investment. When someone suddenly becomes affectionate after a long period of being disengaged, it's worth asking why. Not to accuse, not to start a fight, but to get curious. What changed? What shifted? Are they actually more present or just more performative? People who are about to cheat often know deep down that they're doing something that goes against their better nature. Even if they rationalize it, there's still a part of them that wants to maintain the image of being a good person. So they play the part, they act caring, they go through the motions. They may even convince themselves that these gestures prove they still care. But caring isn't what happens in moments. It's what happens over time. It's how they show up when it's hard, how they communicate when things are awkward or painful, how they invest in repairing trust when there's been a rupture. Anyone can be charming for a week. Anyone can book a dinner reservation or send a flirty text. That's not love. That's theater. And the most heartbreaking part of this dynamic is that many people fall hardest right before they get hurt. Because they're finally being given the attention they've been craving. The emotional starvation has made them vulnerable to even the smallest crumbs of affection. So when a partner suddenly becomes sweet again, they breathe a sigh of relief. They stop asking questions. They lean back in. And that's exactly when the betrayal hits hardest. Because it wasn't just the act of cheating, it was the act of false hope. The pretending, the illusion that things were finally getting better, only to find out it was just a mask. If something feels off, even in the middle of their sudden charm offensive, listen to that voice. Not with paranoia, but with discernment. Ask deeper questions. Look at patterns, not just moments. You're not crazy for noticing the shift. You're not demanding for wanting consistency. Real love doesn't need smoke and mirrors. It just shows up day after day with honesty and care. If someone is trying too hard to convince you that everything is fine, it's often because deep down they know it isn't. And no amount of charm can cover that forever. When someone cheats, it never starts with the act. It starts with the subtle changes, the silent alarms, the emotional disconnects that we often feel before we see. And the most painful part isn't always the betrayal itself. It's realizing how long you were made to question your own instincts. This speech wasn't just about exposing cheaters. It was about empowering you to trust yourself again. Because the truth is, your gut is... If you feel like something is off, it probably is. You deserve clarity, consistency, and connection, not confusion wrapped in charm. The right person won't make you chase honesty or feel like you have to decode their behavior. They'll meet you with openness, not secrecy. They'll build trust, not chip away at it behind your back. So protect your peace, honor your intuition, and never apologize for choosing your own emotional safety over someone else's comfort. When you start doing that, you stop attracting people who cheat and start drawing in people who cherish